When Barron Trump gave up his first-class seat to an elderly veteran, no one expected the stunning family secret that would unfold mid-flight. What happened next left the entire plane speechless. The cabin lights flickered faintly as passengers settled into their seats, the usual mix of pre-flight anticipation and mild chaos filling the air. It was a brisk morning at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, and Flight 247 to Newark was fully booked. Among the crowd of travelers sat a young man in first class, a face many recognized instantly, though his demeanor suggested he wished they wouldn't. Oh, Barron Trump, now a teenager standing over 6 feet tall, sat quietly by the window, thumbing through a hardcover book. Unlike others in his family, he rarely appeared in the public eye, but the name on his boarding pass made attention unavoidable. Across the aisle, an elderly man in his late 70s shuffled into the economy section. His silver hair was neatly combed, his back slightly hunched, and his gait deliberate as he clutched his boarding pass and an aged leather duffel bag. Passengers exchanged glances as he passed by. His military jacket, adorned with faded patches and medals, told a story of service and sacrifice. Some whispered, wondering about his past, while others simply admired the quiet dignity in his stride. He took his seat near the rear of the plane, wedged between a chatty businessman and a restless toddler. Meanwhile, flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles, ensuring everyone was seated for takeoff. Just as the cabin door closed, a ripple of tension coursed through the air. The elderly veteran's seatmate had become visibly upset, insisting he needed a different seat. The veteran, apologizing for the inconvenience, tried to calm the situation, but the commotion drew Barron's attention from his comfortable spot in first class. He watched the scene unfold, his brows furrowing in thought. Without a word, he pressed the call button for a flight attendant. When she arrived, Barron spoke softly. "Excuse me, can I switch seats with the gentleman in the military jacket?" The flight attendant blinked, momentarily stunned. Passengers in first class glanced up from their newspapers and tablets. Curiosity piqued. The young Trump's offer was unexpected, especially in a world where privilege often went unchallenged. But his expression was earnest, and his tone left no room for negotiation. "Let me check," the attendant replied, her voice carrying a note of surprise as she walked briskly toward the back of the plane. As Barron stood to grab his carry-on bag, murmurs in first class grew louder. A woman across the aisle leaned toward him. "You don't have to do that, you know." "You paid for this seat," she said, her voice tinged with confusion. Barron simply smiled and shrugged. Some people deserve it more. What happened next would change the tone of the entire flight. The flight attendant returned moments later, her expression a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "He said he'd be happy to switch," she informed Barron, her voice carrying a slight tremble. It wasn't every day that someone voluntarily gave up a first-class seat, let alone a teenager with a name that turned heads. Barron smiled politely and nodded, grabbing his bag before making his way down the narrow aisle. Passengers whispered as he passed, some nudging each other to confirm what they were witnessing. A few even reached for their phones, subtly snapping photos. But Barron seemed unaffected by the attention, his focus solely on the man now seated near the back. When Barron arrived, the elderly veteran looked up in surprise. His weathered hands rested on his lap, gripping his duffel bag as if unsure whether to accept the unexpected offer. "Sir," Barron said with a respectful nod, "I believe this seat belongs to you today." The man hesitated, his eyes searching Barron's face for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, he finally smiled, standing slowly. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never expected something like this." "It's the least I can do," Barron replied. As the veteran made his way toward first class, the murmurs among passengers turned into quiet reflection. Some glanced at Barron with newfound respect, while others shifted in their seats, perhaps reconsidering their own assumptions about privilege and gratitude. Barron settled into his new seat near the back of the plane, his long legs slightly cramped, but his expression content. The plane took off, and as the flight progressed, a flight attendant approached Barron with a note. "The gentleman up front asked me to give this to you," she said. Barron unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the neat, careful handwriting. "You don't know this, but your grandfather helped me once, a long time ago. Fred Trump gave me a place to stay when I had nowhere to go after Vietnam. I never got to thank him properly. I guess this is my chance. Your kindness today means more than you know." Barron exhaled, staring at the words. A quiet smile played at his lips as he folded the note carefully and tucked it into his book. The flight continued, but something had shifted. The air felt lighter, as if kindness had softened the edges of the world, if only for a moment. By the time the plane landed, the moment had passed, but the lesson remained. Respect, gratitude, and kindness transcend status, and sometimes the simplest gestures leave the deepest impact. The elderly veteran looked up, confused. "Are you sure, young man?" he asked, his voice weathered but firm. "You don't have to do this for me." "I want to," Barron replied, extending a hand. "Thank you for your service. Please, take my seat." The veteran hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to accept the gesture, but the sincerity in Barron's eyes was undeniable. Slowly, the man stood, shaking Barron's hand firmly. "Well, thank you. That's mighty kind of you." As the veteran made his way to first class, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A young mother in row 15 whispered to her teenage daughter, "Did you see that? He just gave up his seat." The businessman seated next to Barron glanced over, raising an eyebrow. "Never seen anything like that on a flight," he muttered, half to himself. Barron slid into the now vacant economy seat, adjusting his tall frame to fit the tighter space. He seemed completely at ease, ignoring the scattered stares from fellow passengers. A flight attendant passed by and discreetly asked if he needed anything, but Barron simply shook his head and opened his book again. In first class, the veteran settled into the plush seat, visibly overwhelmed by the comfort and unexpected kindness. He adjusted the armrest, his hands trembling slightly. A flight attendant approached him, offering a complimentary drink and a warm blanket. "The young man said you should have this seat," she explained. The veteran smiled faintly. "It's been years since I've been treated like this," he murmured. He glanced back toward the economy section, where Barron sat calmly, now absorbed in his book. The gesture had been small in action, but monumental in its impact. For a moment, the cabin seemed to exhale as the tension of boarding dissipated. Passengers settled in, and the plane taxied onto the runway. But as the engines roared to life and the flight lifted into the air, the story was far from over. What seemed like a simple act of kindness was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. The veteran speaks. As the flight reached cruising altitude, the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with drinks and snacks, but the atmosphere was anything but routine. Passengers couldn't stop glancing between Barron Trump in the economy section and the elderly veteran now seated in first class. Whispers of admiration spread, but the story was only beginning to unfold. The veteran sat quietly at first, sipping his water and staring out of the window. His hands rested on his lap, the faintest tremor visible. Then, as if compelled by the weight of the moment, he turned to the passenger seated next to him, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "I have to say something," he began, his voice just loud enough to be heard. The woman looked at him, curious. The veteran adjusted the small pin on his lapel, a purple heart, and sighed deeply. "That young man who gave me this seat, his family saved my life once." The woman blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" The veteran leaned back, his voice growing steadier as he began his story. "It was decades ago, during the Vietnam War. I was stationed overseas, far from home, with no family support. I'd been injured badly, shot twice in the leg. When I finally got stateside, I was lost. No direction, no purpose, nothing." His voice wavered, but he continued. "I ended up in New York trying to rebuild my life. I didn't have a place to stay, barely enough money for food. One day I ran into a man outside a diner who saw me struggling. He didn't just hand me $1 and walk away. He sat with me, listened to my story. The woman's brow furrowed. Who was he? The veteran's gaze grew distant, his expression softening. That man was Donald Trump's father, Fred Trump. The woman's eyes widened, and a few passengers nearby, who had been subtly eavesdropping, leaned closer. Fred Trump, she repeated, incredulous. The veteran nodded, his expression growing wistful. Yes. He didn't owe me a thing, but he made sure I had a roof over my head and a job to get back on my feet. He never asked for anything in return. Just told me, "You served this country, it's the least we can do." I'll never forget those words. By now, the conversation had caught the attention of several passengers in first class, and the story began to ripple through the cabin. The veteran's voice carried just enough for those around him to hear. I never got to thank Fred properly. And now, his grandson just gave up his seat for me. I don't believe in coincidences. A flight attendant who had overheard wiped at her eyes discreetly. The businessman who had muttered earlier now sat in stunned silence. Back in economy, Barron remained unaware of the conversation unfolding in first class. He simply turned a page in his book, oblivious to the way his simple act of kindness had set off an extraordinary chain of events. Word spread throughout the plane, and by the time the flight attendants made their final rounds, something had changed. The usual sense of anonymity that filled a crowded aircraft had given way to something else, something more profound. Passengers glanced at Barron with new eyes, not as a name they recognized, but as a young man who had done something extraordinary without seeking recognition. When the plane landed and passengers began gathering their belongings, the veteran waited for Barron near the exit. As Barron stepped forward, the man placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You don't know what this meant to me, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Barron smiled. It was the right thing to do. The veteran nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pin, a replica of the one he wore on his jacket. "This is for you," he said, a small token of appreciation. Barron hesitated, then accepted it with quiet reverence. As they parted ways, the weight of the moment lingered. Some gestures may seem small at the time, but their impact can last a lifetime. That day, Barron Trump proved that kindness and respect transcend generations, and for everyone on that flight, it was a reminder that sometimes the simplest actions tell the most powerful stories. The veteran's voice grew stronger as he continued, his eyes misting with gratitude. "I always wanted to thank his family, but I never got the chance. Life moved on, and I thought the moment was lost forever. And now, today, that man's grandson, he's given me a gift I'll never forget." His voice wavered with emotion as he shook his head in disbelief. What are the odds of something like this happening? In economy, Barron sat unaware of the growing buzz around the plane. He was engrossed in his book, his long legs awkwardly tucked into the cramped space. But in first class, the veteran's revelation had ignited something deeper. Passengers exchanged glances, murmurs of amazement spreading like wildfire. One of the flight attendants leaned toward the veteran. "Would you like me to tell him what you just shared?" she asked softly. The veteran hesitated, then shook his head. "No, not yet. Let the boy have his peace. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me, not right now." But the passengers couldn't contain their astonishment. What had started as a simple act of kindness now carried a sense of destiny, as if the universe had aligned just for this moment. And then, something even more remarkable happened. The veteran sat quietly for a few moments, his story lingering in the air like an unspoken challenge. Nearby passengers exchanged glances, some leaning in closer to share their own thoughts in hushed tones. The flight had transformed from a routine journey into something far more profound. It was the man seated directly across from the veteran who broke the silence. He was in his early 40s with a tired but approachable face. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But your story really hit home. My grandfather served in Vietnam, too. He used to talk about how much it meant when people back home cared enough to help. Hearing what Fred Trump did for you, well, that's rare." The veteran nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. "It's the little things, son. People don't realize how far a small act of kindness can go. Back then, I thought my life was over. But that man's generosity gave me a second chance." Across the aisle, a young mother cradling a sleeping toddler chimed in. "You know, my dad used to say the same thing. He wasn't a veteran, but he always told me that when someone lifts you up, even just a little, you pass it on. It's like a chain reaction. What Barron did today, it's proof that kindness still matters." The veteran's eyes softened as he listened. "It's true. And it's not just about big gestures. Sometimes just being seen, being acknowledged, can change everything. That's what Fred Trump did for me. And it's what his grandson has done for me again today." The passengers continued to share their stories, each one more heartfelt than the last. A flight attendant, visibly moved, perched on the armrest of an empty seat near the veteran. "I wasn't planning to say anything," she admitted, "but my brother served in Iraq. He didn't talk much about it, but when he came home he told me that the people who stopped to thank him or help him out in small ways, those were the moments that stuck with him. Sometimes those moments were the only thing keeping him going." The veteran nodded in understanding, his expression a mix of empathy and quiet pride. "Your brother's right. It's the little things that keep you grounded when everything else feels like it's falling apart." In economy, Barron noticed a few passengers glancing back at him, their faces a mixture of awe and gratitude. He didn't understand the full context of what was happening yet, but he offered a polite nod to one woman who smiled at him. What had started as a simple seat exchange had set off a chain reaction of reflection and connection, one that no one on that flight could have predicted. The veteran turned back to the flight attendant and spoke with a quiet certainty. "You know, I've always believed that gratitude doesn't just stop with the person who helps you. It grows. Fred Trump helped me rebuild my life, and I've spent every day since trying to honor that by helping others." Today, Barron reminded me of that mission. The flight continued on its course, but for those on board, something had changed. It wasn't just another trip from one city to another. It was a reminder that kindness, real, simple, human kindness, has the power to connect people in ways no one expects. Barron remained unaware of the magnitude of what was unfolding around him. To him, it had been the right thing to do. Nothing more, nothing less. But for everyone else on that flight, it was a moment they would never forget. It's funny how life works, isn't it? The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting everyone slightly, but the mood in the cabin remained steady. Conversations carried on, a shared catharsis among the passengers, as if they were all connected by an invisible thread of kindness, gratitude, and human resilience. Just as the plane began its descent, the most unexpected moment of all unfolded. The chatter in first class quieted. The veteran sat with his hands folded, gazing out of the window, lost in thought. Across the cabin, passengers exchanged knowing glances, still marveling at the unusual turn of events. As the captain announced the final approach, a flight attendant, who had been quietly observing everything, walked toward Barron in economy. Kneeling slightly to meet his eye level, she spoke in a soft voice. "I wanted to let you know that the gentleman you gave your seat to shared something extraordinary about your family. Would you like to hear it?" Barron looked up from his book, his curiosity piqued. He closed the cover slowly, the title unreadable to those around him. "Sure," he replied simply, his tone calm but intrigued. The attendant hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Years ago, your grandfather, Fred Trump, helped him when he was at his lowest point. He told me your grandfather gave him a place to live and a job, expecting nothing in return. And today you did something for him that reminded him of that kindness." For a moment Barron didn't speak. His expression remained composed, but his eyes softened as though the weight of the revelation was settling over him. He finally said, "That's something, isn't it?" The flight attendant smiled. "It is. I thought you should know." As the plane touched down, the veteran stood, preparing to disembark. To everyone's surprise, he walked directly to the economy section, his eyes scanning the rows until they landed on Barron. The young man, now standing to retrieve his bag, looked up, caught off guard. The veteran extended his hand. "Young man, I wanted to thank you face to face. What you did today, it brought me full circle. Your family has a history of kindness, and you've carried that forward. Never forget how much these moments matter." Barron shook his hand firmly, his voice steady but quiet. "I didn't do anything special, sir. You deserved it." The cabin fell silent. Passengers watched the exchange unfold, captivated by the unexpected connection. Some had tears in their eyes, while others wore small, thoughtful smiles. The bond between these two men, generations apart, felt like a living testament to the power of empathy and gratitude. As the passengers disembarked, many paused to thank Barron for his gesture. Others approached the veteran, offering handshakes and words of gratitude for his service. The atmosphere was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced on a flight before. At the gate, just before stepping away, the veteran turned once more, tipping his hat toward Barron. "You've got a good heart, son. Don't ever lose that." Barron nodded, his usual reserved demeanor softening just enough to reveal the impact of those words. As he walked toward the baggage claim, he pulled out his phone and typed a brief message. He hesitated for a moment, then hit send. The text read, "Grandpa would have been proud today." The story of Barron Trump and the veteran on the flight reminds us that kindness always holds value, no matter how small. In today's fast-paced world where people are often too busy to notice one another, a simple act of kindness can make a significant difference. Take the time to care for those around you, especially the elderly, veterans, or anyone facing hardships. Sometimes, a small gesture, whether it's listening, offering help, or showing respect, can leave a lasting impact and inspire others to do the same. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to spread the message of respect and fairness. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more meaningful stories. Every like, comment, and subscription helps us continue sharing important messages and promoting positive change in society. Let's build a community where kindness and fairness are always a priority. Together, we can make a difference.